Welcome to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we're going to address, a fascinating topic in general, one that really kind of connects the strength of the free press with civic engagement, but also reminds us that part of the responsibility of living in a purportedly free society is being vigilant and paying attention to the things that happen around us, particularly in our public institutions, but also private ones that allegedly serve the public interest. Today, our guest for the first segment here is no stranger to the Project Censored audience. Is Dr. Steve Macek. He's a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College. He is the co-coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliates program. He works with Andy Lee Roth and others on our top censored story list every year, as well as Deja Vu News. Steve Macek, welcome back to the Project Censored show.
Mickey, thanks so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
It is. And to set up this segment, I want to pull a piece you have from a wonderful dispatch you just published. It's over at projectcensored.org, LA Progressive, and other places. You and Mitchell Sapanchik, Shapincek, sorry, thank you for that, Steve. Shapincek, who's also a software engineer and a longtime organizer and writer with the media activist group Chicago Media Action. You all just wrote a wonderful, important piece. Time to take away Fox's broadcast licenses. Now, that's a pretty provocative title, but let me qualify as you do here. You say, although stripping an established TV station of its broadcast license may seem like an extreme measure, the Fox Corporation's record of malfeasance and its repeated betrayal of the public trust justifies the action in this case. Indeed, an argument can be made that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, should take away every single one of the corporation's broadcasting licenses. And I'll take it one step further, and you say, of course, consider the evidence. Today in this segment, we're going to be considering the evidence.
We will certainly consider the evidence.
And I will say, before we even get started down the road, before I hear a bunch of people already writing emails, it's not just Fox. I get it.
No,
we're not. The problem here is not just ownership Fox. There is a problem. There are other problems with other stations, and people will see what those are along the way here. But we've got to start somewhere, Steve Macek, and Fox is an extraordinary, if not extreme, example of what you talk about with Mitchell in this piece. Can you talk about it for us, Steve Macek?
Sure. So the occasion for this piece is that a group called the Media and Democracy Project in Philadelphia filed a petition to deny the renewal of the broadcast license for WTFX, which is, I think, Channel 29 in Philadelphia, which is the Fox affiliate in Philadelphia, on the grounds that, first of all, that it disseminated the false narrative about Joe Biden allegedly stealing the election from Donald Trump back in 2020. It perpetuated lies and conspiracies about smart tech and the Dominion voting machines being somehow rigged. And in the process, it sowed seeds of dissent in the country, and actually contributed in some way to the January 6th insurgency, to inspiring the January 6th insurgency. But more important, and I think more to the point, there is a lot of evidence, which I think we're going to get into in this program, that come from Fox's own internal emails and messages and emails sent and text messages sent by Fox executives and senior Fox News personalities that reveal that Fox knowingly manipulated its audience by spreading lies and propaganda that they knew at the time were false, and they did it not for ideology, although you could imagine that some of the people at Fox are true believers in this right-wing ideology that they spout all the time. They did it because they were terrified of it hurting their ratings and hurting revenues, which is the lowest form of motivation, right? And so this group, Media and Democracy Project, has filed, in filing this petition to deny the renewal, has put the FCC on notice that they should hold a evidentiary hearing into the accuracy and the evidence behind their charges and hold Fox to account for its performance most recently in the election. And this is something that we as listeners, right, and members of the American public have a right to do. The public has standing in anytime the FCC considers whether or not to renew a broadcast license holder's license, because broadcasters are required by the terms of their license to serve, quote, the public interest, convenience, and necessity. It is very similar to public utilities. If you look at the law surrounding, like, electrical power companies, water companies, it's sewage companies, they are regulated differently than other businesses. They're private corporations, they're private businesses, but they are supposed to operate, because they're in many cases natural monopolies. They're supposed to operate in the public interest. And broadcasters, radio broadcasters, television broadcasters, are in the U.S. are obligated to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And the FCC lays out fairly clearly some criteria under which supposedly license holders who fail to live up to this standard, the PCAN standard, the public interest, convenience, and necessity standard, can lose their licenses. Now, as I will discuss later, it doesn't happen very often. It's incredibly rare. It's like a unicorn.
Indeed.
When the FCC takes away a station's license. Most of the time when they take away a station's license, it's because of financial mismanagement, where the station is like, it's bankrupt, or it's deeply in debt, or it's violated a bunch of the technical rules that the FCC has in place for broadcasters. Only twice in history has the FCC taken away a license for lack of fairness, or the kinds of for the kinds of charges that the Media and Democracy Project are bringing against Project Censored, but against WTFX.
Yes.
But I can go into that in a little bit more detail if you'd like.
Yeah, a couple things. We're definitely going to do that, Steve Macek. But one thing I wanted to just bring out to the forefront of our conversation here. Thank you for that great overview and introduction to what's happening and what your piece is about. You can see it at projectcensored.org under the dispatches for media and politics. Time to take away Fox's broadcast licenses. And again, as I mentioned earlier, one would think that through this process of public review, et cetera, that this may clearly apply to other stations and channels, not just Fox, but
it may, and I can go into that. I think the case of Fox is so extreme,
right? Exactly.
that it merits taking away the license. Yes. It separates them out. They're in an entirely different, as we say,
yes,
as we put it in the op-ed, an ignoble class of their own.
Yeah, indeed. So the reason I want to get to this a little bit is because one of the, we've been promoting this article. And, because we want to get people thinking and talking about it. Oftentimes people more cynically say, well, of course we know that this happens and there's lies and corruption, but what can we do? What can we do? Well, your piece is a primer, and well, here's what people do, and here's what you can do. And you can even do this in your own communities when these things are happening. But here's the question that was posed. And of course, I suspect you'll have a retort.
Sure.
I know I did. One of the criticisms was, well, isn't this a form of censorship? You're trying to take away Fox News. That's censorship. And of course, my reply was, no, this is a due process issue for a public check on power of private entities to control things that are in the public interest. But Steve Macek, I want to hear your view.
Yeah, no, this is, I was expecting a question like this. It always comes up. And in fact, the Fox Corporation, in responding to the Media and Democracy Project petition to deny, filed a reply, an extensive reply prepared by their expensive lawyers that basically said this is an attack on the First Amendment rights of the Fox Corporation. Mm-hmm. Well, broadcasters don't have First Amendment rights, because if you are broadcasting terrestrially, yes, right, over the airwaves,
yes,
it is a scarce resource, which is why the government regulates it. And if you look at the history behind the creation of the FCC, it was created back in 1934 with the Communication Act of 1934, in part because The big broadcasters were upset that little station signals were, this was back
Cutting
when
in.
all broadcasting was radio.
Radio,
We're
yep.
cutting into their signals. And so they wanted the government to come in and impose some order on the airwaves, because otherwise you had, stations like, say, WGN here in Chicago having, small, like, labor-owned stations, signals bleeding into them, and they didn't like that. That was hurting their advertising revenues and so on. So the FCC came in and assigns each station to a particular place on the broadcasting dial, and in return, they're obligated to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. They have to do a lot of things as part of that requirement. One thing is they have to participate in the emergency broadcasting system. They have to air public service announcements. If it's a television station, they're required to air 3 hours of educational children's programming every week. So they're not free to do whatever they want. And we all know that there are those 7 words that you can't say over the airwaves, right?
George Carlin Pacifica. We're on Pacifica right now.
Right. They're also obligated to maintain certain standards of decency, which would be completely a violation of the First Amendment if you tried to impose that on a newspaper or a magazine, right? But is perfectly acceptable if it's a broadcast media that is regulated by the FCC.
What about folks that say it's cable or what have you? It's those.
Well, so the thing is that Fox News, right, is part of the same parent company that owns the licenses for these broadcast television stations. And one of the things that's charged by the Media and Democracy Project and their filing is that the Fox News's performance during the election of 2020 and since it proves that they lack the character required to hold a broadcast license. Not only that, but several segments that were produced by Fox News, this 24-hour cable news channel, were re-aired as part of Sunday morning shows on WTFX, right? So it's not the case that they're completely separate. They take the broadcast, Fox's broadcast outlets take syndicated programming from cable. The same personalities show up over and over again, but nevertheless, the fact is that the performance of Fox News demonstrates that the owners, in this case, the Murdoch family, Rupert and Lachlan, who is now the kind of corporate heir apparent of the Fox Corporation, lack the character required of broadcast license holders.
Well, and you write specifically under consider the evidence in this piece. Transcripts of Fox News coverage during the 2 weeks after the 2020 election show Fox reporters and opinion makers, get ready, made nearly 600 statements casting doubt on the election outcome or promoting conspiracy theories about the balloting process. And the important thing is they were promoting these without evidence, without verified evidence, and were even promoting known falsehoods. And the emails and leaked things that came out afterwards showed that they were knowingly behind the scenes talking about the false information that they were disseminating.
Absolutely. So I'm sure your listeners are all aware of the Dominion defamation suit, the Dominion Corporation that made these voting machines that,
which is another problem for another show.
Another problem for another show brought a lawsuit against Fox for, perpetuating this preposterous idea that somehow the machines were being used to fix the election for Joe Biden, and that somehow Hugo Chavez had something to do. Hugo Chavez had something to do with it, even though he was already dead.
Yeah, sure.
And so they brought this defamation suit, as they should have. And I'm not actually, as somebody who teaches about First Amendment law, I'm not generally a big fan of defamation suits. But in this case, they so savaged this corporation's good reputation on the air, day in and day out, during that period immediately following the election through the inauguration, that I thought it was justified. And in the end, Fox settled for something just short of $750 billion. We're not sure, we're not sure the exact figures, but something just short of $750 billion. And in the process, right, of the discovery process, where the opposing counsels have to share documents with each other. All of these, internal emails, text messages from Fox executives, from Rupert Murdoch and close friends of his who were former Fox executives, came out that revealed that they knew that they were pushing a lie. Fox News has an internal fact-checking organization that they call the Brain Room, and the Brain Room concluded that all of the stories they were pushing about the fixed election were 100% false and total BS.
Yeah. Well,
to quote from the emails. So they knew that they were pushing, that they were deliberately misleading their audience, and that's what actually sets them apart. So, a lot of people, and I myself have been party to a petition to deny and filed an informal objection to the renewal of the license of WGN TV here in Chicago back in 2006. And one of the things I pointed to in my informal objection was their abysmal coverage of the debate about whether or not to invade Iraq, that where they they lent credence to what turned out to be a complete fabrication, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he had some sort of relationship with Al Qaeda and other Islamist terrorists. That nothing could be further from the truth. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have a smoking gun in that case that proves that they knew that they were pushing a bunch of lies. Whereas in the case of Fox News, we do.
We do. And unfortunately, Fox didn't lead the way then, although they were certainly a big part of the New York Times and others. Yeah, there were a lot of falsehoods being peddled from a lot of fronts.
The entire news media system in the U.S. was complicit in perpetuating this pro-war propaganda against Iraq.
Which, by the way,
knows that.
Which, by the way, since we seem to be a permanent warfare state, we should be ever vigilant about these things, right?
Absolutely.
So at any rate, I need to take a quick break here because we're halfway through the segment with Steve Macek. We're talking about a recent co-authored piece he has. It's under the Project Censored Dispatches for Media and Politics. Time to take away Fox's broadcast licenses. We'll be back on the Project Censored show talking to Steve Macek about more of the details in the case after this brief musical break. Stay tuned. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in this segment, we are honored to welcome back to the show Steve Macek. Steve Macek is a professor of communications at North Central College, and he's also co-coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliates program. Steve is talking to us from outside of Chicago. We're talking about a recent co-authored piece about removing Fox's broadcast licenses because of their fraudulent and false reporting, both around the 2020 election, after the election, around the events of January 6, 2021. And of course, most recently, there's more. They've taken to attacking Special Prosecutor Jack Smith for bringing criminal charges against former President Donald Trump. And of course, there's yet even more. There's a great deal more evidence that you even have in the piece here. So Steve Macek, let's talk to our listeners again. When we started this conversation, we were talking about this being maybe what some people would say is an extreme measure, the revocation of the license. Let's consider the evidence. Go ahead.
Yeah. So let me just, before I plunge further into the evidence against Fox, the case against Fox, let me just say that it is an extreme case. And I'm not somebody who advocates generally flippantly taking away broadcasters' licenses. I mean, I think it should be for serious wrongdoing, right?
Demonstrable fact-based
wrongdoing and violation of the public trust, right?
Yes.
I think on those grounds, you could argue that lots of the national media networks, the broadcast national media networks, ABC, NBC, Fox, should lose their licenses. Let me just be clear. But I think we should kind of hold we shouldn't take people's licenses away impetuously. And really what this petition is calling for is for the FCC to hold a hearing, an evidentiary hearing where testimony could be taken evidence could be offered that would be open to the public, so people could see what the where the balance of evidence lies in this case, and that would have a positive, a beneficial effect, even if the FCC never took away the WTFX's license, right? It would have a beneficial effect of providing some transparency about the internal operations of the media, of chastening them for violating the public trust. It would have a beneficial effect. So let me just say that from the outset, that even if this petition to deny is unsuccessful at taking away their license, it's a positive thing because it raises people's awareness of the flaws of our corporate media system, and it provides an opportunity for us to look in detail at the evidence that they are not doing a good job of serving us.
Absolutely.
Serving their audience. So what is the evidence? Well, we point, of course, to the discovery from the Dominion libel case. That is the smoking gun that proves that they knew what they were doing, what they were.
But they settled to avoided legal scrutiny, right? In terms of
settled to
legal
avoid legal scrutiny,
right,
and to avoid having to apologize. Although a number of the Fox News personalities, right, that were involved in spreading these lies have since left the network. Like Tucker Carlson mysteriously was dropped.
Right.
You wonder why, right? After they paid out almost $1 billion, almost $1 billion, right? $750 million of $1 billion. You wonder why. But beyond that, we can go back and look at the history of the Murdoch family. I mean, the Murdoch family used to own something called, and the predecessor of the Fox Corporation is News Corporation. Back in 2012, there was the world, the media world was rocked by the Hackergate scandal in Britain, where it was discovered that journalists who worked for News Corporation, the forerunner of Fox Corporation, were hacking into the cell phones of celebrities and people who were in the news, including victims of crime, to get access to their emails. And it so scandalized British society that an official inquiry was parliamentary inquiry was launched into sort of the moral and ethical shortcomings of the media. Is called the Levinson inquiry because of this Lord Levinson who headed it up, and they concluded that like Fox was guilty of like mismanagement and not controlling their journalists who were engaged in rampant, unethical, just appallingly unethical behavior. In fact, Mitchell Schapinchik, my co-author on this piece, when the Levinson inquiry concluded its work and issued this massive report, and your listeners can go online and read the Levinson inquiry report. I mean, it's thousands of pages. I would encourage you to just read the executive summary, which is, I think, maybe like 80 pages. We wrote an op-ed saying that Fox's license should be taken away. Then that was back in 2012 or
over a decade ago. Yeah,
over a decade. I think maybe it was even 2015. It might have been even 2015. But yeah, we wrote an essay saying take them away. Since then, of course, the corporate Fox corporations had to pay out $90 million to settle all these sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual harassment cases, including some involving people who are at the highest level of the corporation, like Roger Ailes, who was the head of Fox News, and Bill O'Reilly, who was at the time their star media personality, and there are countless reports about how toxic that place is to work for women, including recently.
You wrote about the whistleblower Abby Grossberg,
right? Including Abby Grossberg, who was working for them not too long ago, and claims that she was subjected to, she was exposed, at least maybe not subjected, but exposed to all sorts of misogynist humor and sexist humor, and was coerced by the company into giving a false deposition in the Dominion case. So the track record of unethical and corrupt and just flat out malicious behavior is so egregious that it merits at least a closer look, which is actually all this petition to deny can ask for, because the public can ask the FCC to look into it. And that's what we're doing.
I mean, this is civic engagement, media democracy in action, really. This is what we, the people, are supposed to do. We're supposed to utilize these institutions and the FCC to hold these corporate, quote, owners of the public airwave leases or whatever, however we want to word that.
Right. And we couldn't always do that. I think it's important for your listeners to know that even though, this requirement that broadcasters serve the public interest has been on the books since 1934, up until 1969, the FCC claimed that it was the sole representative of the public interest in adjudicating whether or not, or determining whether or not to renew a broadcaster's license. So they didn't even solicit input from the public. They substituted their judgment for the judgment of the public, and the public had no standing. It was only during the midst of the civil rights movement that a minister with the United Church of Christ, who was an ally, a white minister who was an ally of Martin Luther King, named Everett Parker, who was the head of the United Church of Christ's communication office, brought a lawsuit that in 1964, demanding the right to be heard by the FCC about the renewal of the broadcast license at WLBT, this TV station in Jackson, Mississippi, that was owned by the White Citizens Council, that had or had board members, I should say, that were affiliated with White Citizens Council. Actually had a White Citizens Council bookstore in the that popped up in the offices of the TV station that would preempt, that is to say, block any news reports about the civil rights movement, so that viewers couldn't learn about what was happening in their own backyard. That when Thurgood Marshall appeared on the Today Show, they actually preempted. They preempted the broadcast because they didn't want their listeners to hear Thurgood Marshall speak over their airwaves. So he brought the United Church of Christ brought a lawsuit, and the lawsuit ultimately was settled where a court said that yes, the public does have a standing, they do have a right to be heard in these license renewal cases. It wasn't until a few years after that they actually succeeded in taking the license, the license away from WLBT, and even then the FCC declined to do it on their own. They were ordered to do it by a court.
Interesting. So these institutions that are supposed to support and reflect the public interest are, as Ralph Nader would talk about, corporate capture. They're part of a regulatory captured network.
Absolutely. Then that's certainly true of the FCC. It's been true of the FCC.
I mean, at least back then we had Newton Minow, we had Nicholas Johnson, Nicholas Johnson.
You had a few independent FCC commissioners,
right?
But on balance, that means, so like as I said, they've only taken away a couple of licenses for abrogation of public service requirements, right? Or of basic fairness. That's which is appalling if you know anything about the American media. It is, as Newton Minow said, a vast wasteland.
That is right.
So why have they only ever in their entire history taken away 2 licenses?
And since you riffed there on Minow, back to Nick Johnson, your second priority has got to be media democracy, media reform. This is everybody's issue,
right? Because
if you don't have access to accurate information, everything about whatever you're doing, on top of that or in front of that is going to be bunk, garbage in, garbage out. And that's a real challenge. And this is why you and Mitchell write that, and we only have a couple minutes left.
Sure.
But that's why you said that Fox Corporation stands in an ignoble class all its own. And you even cite Fox executive Preston Padden.
Right. Former Fox executive. He was one of the people who built Fox up into the network it is. I think he then went on to work for Disney and some other, but he remained a close friend of Rupert Murdoch. Now he has now concluded that Rupert Murdoch and his son, Rupert Murdoch's son, Lachlan Murdoch, are no longer fit to hold broadcast licenses. And he's not the only former Fox executive who feels this way. So Jamie Kellner was the founding president of the Fox Broadcasting Company, and he filed a supporting brief that supports the Media and Democracy Project's petition to deny. He filed an informal objection to the renewal of the FTFX license. William Crystal, who is, a right-wing commentator and conservative who served under George Bush and Reagan, has also added an informal objection to the renewal of Fox's license. So a number of people who are either conservatives or former conservatives and have been in the media and been in the media world, worked for Fox, have now concluded that Fox no longer deserves to hold a broadcast license, which I think is really, really telling.
Well, indeed.
They didn't say that after the sexual harassment scandal. They didn't say that after the Levinson inquiry. They're now concluding it's gotten so bad that they should no longer, that this company should no longer be allowed to broadcast.
Well, nothing will wake one up, I guess, in the world of capitalism than a couple $1 billion lawsuit.
Right, a couple $1 billion lawsuit, and also just like the smoking gun of the these emails and messages that prove that they knew they were lying. And that's the thing that I much as I lament the performance of the corporate media in the Iraq War, I don't think you could say Dan Rather, Peter Jennings,
well, they all may have
company knew, right? They've now apologized in after the fact and said that they were wrong about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. I don't think you can say that they knew beforehand,
Steve Macek,
that they were pushing a false narrative.
So to conclude this segment, Steve Macek, again, the bigger problem here is the consequences of these kinds of open lies and falsehoods and abuse of the public trust. The public sees this, and it's amazing that there aren't more cries to really do something about this to hold them accountable, because the ultimate takeaway, and I think the ultimate negative impact on the society, is it further perpetuates public cynicism about free press.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I know your listeners are probably familiar with the fact that, trust in the media is at an all-time low.
Yes.
Media, people trust journalists even less than politicians. And that's saying, and that's saying something, right? And this absolutely contributes to damaging, public trust in the press and in the news media. Absolutely. I think the reason more challenges don't happen, first of all, after the Telecom Act of 1996, the term of licensure is much longer now. It used to be like 2, and then it was like 3
now it's 7
years. Now it's 8 years. Every 8 years. So you only can weigh in every 8 years, and you have to know when your broadcast stations in your area, your state, are up for renewal to be able to kind of intervene. So first, I think there's that. But I do think it's worth doing. And let me just say, even if Fox is not stripped of its broadcast licenses, positive things can be achieved. So back in the 1970s, the National Organization for Women challenged the broadcast license of the ABC affiliate in New York. And they failed. Ultimately, their petition to deny was turned down. But as a result of that affiliate hired more women into key positions of power, right? Into key decision-making positions, and into positions not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera. So it helped to advance the cause of gender equity in the media, even though, the petition to deny was not successful.
So
it can be an educational, in other words, it can be an educational and organizing tool.
Well, that's absolutely why we're featuring this on the program. That's why we are really thrilled that you wrote this piece. Co-wrote this piece. It's freely available, no paywall, at projectcensored.org under the media dispatches and dispatches on media and politics. This piece is called Time to Take Away Fox's Broadcast Licenses. Steve Macek, as ever, thanks so much for joining the program.
Oh, thanks so much for a really stimulating conversation, Mickey. Take
Absolutely.
care.
And thank you specifically, because even if people feel like, well, that's Philadelphia or that's somewhere else, this issue affects all of us. And this program, one of the core missions is to educate the public about press freedoms and how to keep the media free and how to be the media and hold media accountable. And I think this piece goes a long way in this segment, Steve. I think it's a very didactic one, and I think you've given people a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. All right. I'll be seeing you.
Right.
Take care.